Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
I'm Dion Mitchell here with May Anjaria. Today, we will be talking about that old cliche, a fool for a client, namely those individuals who choose to act as their own attorneys.
It was Abraham Lincoln who said that if you represent yourself, you have a fool for a client. And, that's the old joke, and that's generally true, but not always. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I think that most people, you watch Judge Judy or People's Court, and you see people who don't have an attorney. So in small claims court, you can't have an attorney, but we're going to talk about people who represent themselves in the most serious of criminal matters.
I remember when we first started chatting and working together about this, and you were kind of explaining your world of pro pers, and I really had a difficult time of getting my head around exactly what a pro per and why somebody would want to represent themselves in a high stakes case like a murder or rape or something like that. So maybe you can kind of give us a little bit of a breakdown on what is a pro per and why people go as a pro per.
Sure. So literally, pro per comes from the Latin in propria persona. It means that you're acting as your own attorney. So let's go back to a little bit about your right to have an attorney. We know, hey, if you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. And that applies to criminal cases, but not to civil cases. In a civil case, if you can't afford an attorney, you are on your own. And so many of us might be aware that if there's a simple lawsuit or a property or divorce issue, that you might represent yourself if it's not particularly challenging. In small claims court, you can't have an attorney. So again, the Judge Judy, this kind of thing, you don't see an attorney. But in criminal cases, if you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. But there are some people who say, I don't want that attorney. And typically that would be the public defender. And that seems like a foolish move, but it may not be. So to understand how we get there legally, you look at the Sixth Amendment. And that tells us that we have the right to assistance of counsel for defense. And then the 14th Amendment talks about due process. And I think we're all aware of that. But of course, the Constitution can be kind of vague and it has to be drilled down. So when we talk about the public defender system, meaning that, if you're indigent, you can't afford an attorney, you'll get one from the court. That really was not enforced until 1963, if you can believe it. So this was the Supreme Court case of Gideon versus Wainwright, where finally it was ruled by the Supreme Court that if you were indigent, the court or the government would pay for your attorney. And this particular case was interesting. Mr. Gideon was actually accused of stealing about $50 and some booze from a pool hall. And in his first trial, he represented himself because he couldn't afford an attorney. Now he goes to jail, he gets convicted, and he starts learning the law. And he says, wait a minute, what about my Sixth Amendment right? And he starts doing the jailhouse attorney thing, ultimately issuing a writ to the Supreme Court, who hears his case. And they say, you know what? You're right. How can we ensure your Sixth Amendment protection unless we pay for your attorney? So Mr. Gideon had a second trial with an attorney and actually beat the charge.
So that's it. That's the guy. Mr. Gideon was the gateway for everybody to follow at that point.
Mr. Gideon is the origin of our public defense system. Now, we'll talk about that system. So you have the right to paid counsel, but guess what? There has to be a budget behind that. So the practical implication of that is another thing. But now let's get to what about representing yourself? So,
sure. Real quick here. But so he's entitled to, or in today's court system, they're entitled to the same budget, which is really key here, as if they had a court-appointed attorney. Is that correct?
For a pro per.
Yeah. Yes. So if I'm up on a charge and I have a court appointed attorney, and which is paid for by the state. And so let's say I'm going to represent myself as a pro per. There's a budget behind the court appointed attorney. So is that same budget available to me? Investigators, all that comes along with it.
There absolutely is. And let me talk to you in just a second about the process of how I work with attorneys or pro pers, but just kind of finishing the legal discussion. Now we have to get to whether or not you have the right to represent yourself. Because now after 1963, you have the right to an attorney because it was found that you shouldn't have to go on your own. But what if you want to go on your own? So in 1975, we had the Ferretta decision, where this was actually out of L.A. County. This was a grand theft auto case, and Mr. Ferretta wanted to represent himself. Why the hell would he want to do that? Because he felt the public defender was too busy and couldn't give the proper attention to his case. So at some point before trial, the judge ruled that he could not represent himself. And so he was given an attorney, essentially forced upon him, and he lost his trial, and then he appealed to the Supreme Court, and they came back with this ruling in 1975 that allows you to go pro per. So I'm a DNA expert in LA County, and I actually work with pro pers quite a bit. So to get to your question, Dion, the way this works is that if a pro per needs an investigator or a DNA expert or anything else that a real attorney would need, they can petition the court and the county will actually pay for it. So in a typical case, a pro per will either submit a court order for my funding or I'll give them a template, and the court will give me funding to work as the pro per's DNA expert.
So the state is paying you at that point.
Exactly.
Okay, just kind of a sidebar question that just kind of popped up in my head. What is some of the more crazy requests that a pro per has made as part of his defense, aside from you and the typical, ballistic investigators? What's some of the more crazy requests that you've heard of?
Well, it's probably trying to get every expert under the sun, even if it's a relatively simple case, because not every, but a lot of the pro pers, they want essentially the O.J. Simpson dream team, even if it's for like a simple theft or something like that. So it could be many different experts. It could be unreasonable amounts of money. I mean, I should say that it's capped. I mean, I have to give a lot of good reason for what funding I need for a case. I'm not just like blank check, because obviously there's a limited budget to do this.
I think that most people don't realize how many people represent themselves and how many big cases that have probably passed on their ticker while they're watching the news. I was reading this New York Times article, and you had the Fort Hood killer. He represented himself. The Beltway sniper, the 9/11 terrorist, the Long Island railroad shooter. I mean, you could go on, and I think most people don't understand that that's what's going on.
Right. So particularly in those high-profile cases, the defendant will know that they're going to be in the national spotlight. So they might just be a publicity hound, or they might have an agenda that they want to promote. They may want to say something crazy that they know is going to get in the press or is going to get in.
Could that apply to Ted Bundy?
Right, absolutely. I think in his case, it was about ego. He just couldn't relinquish control, and he had to, be the center of attention. Now, he was an intelligent guy, but, he still got convicted.
I'm curious to know, obviously, you mentioned like ego and finding out the details of, about the prosecution's case, but how many high-profile wins are there for a pro per? So it seems like if you're just playing percentages, the chances of you winning your case are slim and none.
Very true. Very true. Now, a lot of these cases are so serious that even a seasoned attorney doesn't have a great chance at winning. So you have to really weigh why you want to go pro per. And there's a couple of categories why people want to do this. And we talked a little bit about the frivolity of doing it. But forget about the high profile cases for a minute. And when I look at the cases in LA County and some of the surrounding counties that I work in, there are sometimes frivolous reasons. And one is that it is going to drag it out, because you can imagine the disarray in the courtroom when a pro per is handling a case and doesn't know the procedure, and everything's just going to take a much longer time.
So, so they're just basically, they just want to see chaos.
They want to see chaos. They want to delay the time that they're going to get sentenced to, state prison.
I guess if if I'm in a jail cell 24 hours a day, it gets me out of the house, so to speak.
No, you're absolutely right. So the other thing is you've got more privileges, because now you're in the law library. You've probably got more phone privileges, and you can now go to the attorney room and meet with your experts and investigators. And like you say, it's like not a get out of jail free card, but close to it. It's better than sitting in your cell.
But you're somebody,
You're somebody.
You're a fool for a client, but you're a somebody while you're a fool for a client.
Absolutely. And there's actually some sinister motivations sometimes too. If you think about some high level gang cases.
Yeah. Tell me that story. I'm sorry, but tell me that story where you were sitting down with, I think it was either sheriff's or LAPD sergeant, and you were getting some case evidence, and he was, kind of reluctant to give it to you or hand it over. And he was telling you what the motivation was. He was a gang member, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. So part of the perk, I guess, if you're representing yourself, is you get discovery from the prosecutor. Police reports, witness statements, evidence, scientific reports. And when that's turned over to certain pro pers, particularly in the gang culture, a lot of that has to be redacted, because there might be a police report that says such and such witness said they saw this person. And guess what? There's going to be the name of the witness. There's going to be an address. So it's a way for, if somebody's very nefarious, to kind of get at some of the witnesses. So all of that has to be very carefully controlled when the inmate's actually representing themselves.
Well, with that said, what's it like working with these guys? How does it work? How do you feel about doing it?
Right. So the way it works is that.
Well, let me stop you there.
Sure.
Okay, so I get how when you're working with the the Robert Shapiros, you get a phone call or an email that says, "Hey, we'd like to get you to consult on this case," but these are guys inside Men's County Jail, right?
Yes.
So how does that? It's not like they got your business card. How do they reach out to you and say, "Hey, how does that work?"
They've got my business card now. It's like any other business development. Your name's word of mouth is the best way to get business. But specifically in LA County, there is a panel of expert witnesses and investigators who basically are pre-approved that an attorney or a pro per can have appointed on their case. So they can actually say, DNA expert Mr. Anjaria, I'd like to file a motion to have him appointed. And in terms of communication, I collect calls from the jail. So that's one way that I can communicate with them. I obviously can't call them. I can't leave them a voicemail. They can't leave me a voicemail. So it is pretty tough. And if you are going to take on these types of cases, you have to go that extra mile and jump through all these hoops. It's nice to sit in a swanky attorney's office and go out to lunch with them, but that's not how it works with the pro pers.
So you just get I guess literally kind of a call out of the blue, and they say, "Hey, I'm interested in bringing you on as my DNA consultant for my case." And then how does that work? You sign paperwork? I mean, how do you get it's formally attached?
It's pretty funny when you talk about a call. Sometimes they're like, "Hey, would you please take my case?" I've had people who interview me. They're like, "Hey, could you tell me a little bit about your career? Could you tell me what articles you've published?" And they are really vetting me, which, hey, I would do the same thing. So ultimately, if they want to have me in their case, they will submit a proposed order to the judge. He or she will sign it. And then I need a copy of that order to begin work. And that's my entry ticket into jail to actually sit down with the pro per and meet with them face to face.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do you feel about doing it? I mean, You've mentioned you've called it the dark side, and in your community or your former or I guess colleagues in law enforcement, or just how about just family members? What's their take on this?
Well, it's highly odd because you are getting calls all hours of the day, and you think about it. It's like working with an attorney who only has one case. So they're laser focused on that. On top of that, it's their own freedom or life at stake. So you can imagine how demanding they might be, much more so than any high profile attorney that I've ever worked with. So there's a lot of calls, there's a lot of jail visits, and ultimately their family members get involved, trying to contact me, email me, coordinating with other experts. It really is a lot messier than just working with an attorney. And I sort of, it was kind of a long road to getting comfortable with working with pro pers. So when I worked when I had co-founded the private laboratory, that was my first taste of getting pro pers. And in the laboratory, a lot of the scientists just didn't want to deal with them. And, they would call the office, and, some of them would get a young lady on the phone and they just want to chit chat. And, some people might find that creepy. And ultimately, because I was a lab director, I'm like, well, I have to do this. So I started getting maybe a little bit more immune to this, just because I had to do it. But as I did it more and more often, I came to really enjoy it because I thought, this is the front line of the criminal justice system. If you're sitting in a lab, you're just looking at a tube, you might lose context about what the case is actually about. And in fact, when I started working in law enforcement crime laboratories, the captain of our unit actually took us to the jail and said, you need to look at this because this is the people that your work affects the most. So I enjoyed kind of being in the front seat and seeing how this works. And you think about it, it's really, in some ways, it's no different than working with an attorney because most attorneys are laypersons when they're trying to understand DNA evidence. So it's the same thing with pro pers, and it's actually kind of fun educating them and seeing them click and understanding what the evidence is. And, you have to be able to explain it to, these are kind of your jurors as well, right? This is the general public, so you have to make it understandable to everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.